I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the receipt. It wasn't the total or the items listed neatly in black ink, but the line at the bottom that read, "Paid by family," excluding Eleanor. For a second, I thought it was a mistake, something printed by accident, the kind of small error you quietly point out and laugh about. But no one said anything. Not my son, not my daughter-in-law, not even the waiter who had just set it down beside my plate like it belonged there. So I smiled, folded the receipt carefully, and placed it next to my napkin as if it meant nothing at all. The restaurant was one of those upscale places Michael liked to show off, all soft lighting and polished wood, where a single steak cost more than what I used to spend on groceries for a week. I had worn my best blouse, the cream one with the small pearl buttons, because family dinners used to mean something to me. They used to feel warm. Across from me, Lauren was laughing, her voice light but sharp around the edges, telling a story about people who always expect others to pick up the tab. She didn't look at me when she said it, but she didn't have to. Michael chuckled, nodding along, his eyes fixed on his glass of wine, as if the reflection inside it was more important than his own mother sitting right in front of him. I reached for my water, my hand steady, even though something inside my chest felt tight, like a thread being pulled too slowly to notice until it started to hurt. I had seen this before, in small ways. Comments that sounded like jokes. Decisions made without asking me. Invitations that came later and later until sometimes they didn't come at all. But tonight was different. Tonight, it was written down, printed clearly for anyone to see, excluding Eleanor. I took a small bite of my meal, chewing carefully, tasting nothing. Around me, the restaurant hummed with quiet conversations and clinking glasses, the kind of normal that makes something wrong feel even louder. Then Michael finally spoke, setting his fork down like he had been rehearsing the moment. "Mom," he said, still not meeting my eyes, "we've been thinking, maybe it's time you considered moving into something smaller. Something easier to manage." The words landed. Softly, almost politely, but they carried a weight I recognized immediately. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a decision already made. I nodded once, slowly, as if I were considering it, as if I hadn't already understood what this dinner was really about. Lauren smiled then, a satisfied kind of smile, and reached for her glass. I folded my hands in my lap and looked at both of them, really looked this time, and realized something I should have seen much sooner. This wasn't just about a bill. This was about erasing me, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to include. And I was just beginning to understand how far they were willing to go. I stayed until the end of the meal, because leaving early would have made it too obvious that I understood what they were doing, and I was not ready to give them that satisfaction. I listened as Lauren ordered dessert without asking if I wanted anything, her voice smooth and practiced, as if she had already stepped into a role that no longer included me. Michael checked his phone twice, maybe 3 times, each glance quick but deliberate, like he was timing something. I noticed the way they spoke to each other in low tones, small exchanges that stopped the moment I looked up. It was subtle, almost invisible, but once you see it, you cannot unsee it. When the bill came back, no one reached for it. Lauren simply slid her card forward, then paused, glancing at the receipt with a faint smile, the kind that does not reach the eyes. I recognized that look. It was the look of someone who believes they have already won. I folded my napkin carefully and placed it beside my plate, taking my time with every movement, because slowing down was the only way to steady the quiet storm building inside me. For years, I had told myself that the distance growing between us was normal, that children build their own lives, that priorities shift. I had excused the missed calls, the last-minute cancellations, the holidays that somehow became smaller and smaller until they no longer included me at all. I remembered the first time Lauren suggested we move Christmas dinner to her side of the family, how Michael had agreed so quickly, almost relieved. I remembered the birthdays where I sent gifts instead of being invited, the polite thank you messages that came hours later, short and efficient. At the time, I told myself it was temporary, that things would settle, that family always finds its way back. Sitting there in that softly lit restaurant, I realized how wrong I had been. This was not something that had happened overnight. This had been building, layer by layer, moment by moment, until it reached this point where I was no longer part of the equation at all. Excluding Eleanor. The words echoed in my mind. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady and undeniable. When we stood to leave, Michael reached for Lauren's coat before even glancing in my direction, a small gesture that said more than any words he had spoken that night. I picked up my purse, the leather worn soft from years of use, and followed them toward the exit. The night air outside was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain, and for a brief moment, I felt something close to clarity. Not anger, not sadness, but a quiet understanding that settled deep in my chest. This dinner had not been about food or conversation or even family. It had been a message, a carefully planned, carefully delivered message. And now that I had received it, the question was no longer whether they meant it. The question was what I was going to do about it. The drive home was quiet, the kind of silence that fills every corner of the car until even the sound of the engine feels too loud. And I kept my eyes on the road, even though I knew every turn by heart, because I needed something steady to focus on while everything else shifted beneath me. When I pulled into my driveway, the porch light flicked on automatically, just like it had for years, a small detail that used to feel welcoming, but now only reminded me how much of my life had stayed the same while everything else had slowly changed without me noticing. I stepped inside and closed the door gently behind me, setting my purse down on the small wooden table by the entrance, the same table Michael had scratched when he was 10 years old, trying to carve his initials into it with a pocket knife he was not supposed to have. I ran my fingers over that faint mark, still there after all these years, and for a moment I could almost hear his laughter echoing through the house, the way he used to call out for me without hesitation, without distance. I moved into the kitchen out of habit, turning on the light and standing there for a second longer than necessary, as if I expected someone to follow me in, to fill the space with conversation, but of course no one did. The house was still, quiet in a way that felt different now, heavier somehow, like it was holding on to something unspoken. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the table, the same seat I had taken every morning for decades, and let the events of the evening settle into place one piece at a time. The receipt, the conversation, the way Michael had avoided looking at me, the way Lauren had smiled. It all lined up too neatly to be accidental. I reached for the small stack of mail I had set aside earlier that day, flipping through it slowly until one envelope caught my attention. It was addressed to me, but the return address was unfamiliar, printed in clean, professional lettering. I had almost ignored it earlier, assuming it was just another bill or advertisement, something routine and unimportant. Now, sitting there in the quiet of my kitchen, it felt different. I slid my finger under the seal and opened it carefully, unfolding the paper inside with steady hands. The words were formal, precise, written in a tone that left no room for misunderstanding. It referenced property records, recent changes, documents that had been processed under my name. I read it once, then again, each line sharpening the uneasy feeling that had been building since dinner. There had been transactions, authorizations, decisions made that I did not remember agreeing to. My eyes moved slowly across the page, taking in details I could not ignore anymore. And for the first time that night, I felt something shift inside me, not confusion, not hurt, but clarity. This had gone further than a conversation at dinner. This had been happening quietly, carefully, behind my back. I folded the letter and placed it flat on the table, aligning it with the edge as if that small act could bring order to something much larger. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the paper, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock on the wall, ordinary sounds that suddenly felt like markers of time I had lost track of. Then I stood up, walked to the hallway, and looked at the framed photos lining the wall, each one a moment I had believed was real, solid, unchangeable. I understood something now that I had not allowed myself to see before. This was not just distance. This was not just neglect. This was a plan, and I had just found the first piece of proof. I did not sleep that night, not because I was restless, but because my mind had finally become too clear to ignore what it had been trying to tell me for years. I sat at the edge of my bed with the letter in my hands, reading it again under the soft glow of the bedside lamp, tracing each line as if the meaning might change if I looked closely enough. It did not. The language was careful, legal, distant, but the message beneath it was unmistakable. Someone had acted in my name. Someone had moved pieces of my life without my permission. I thought back to the documents I had signed over the past year, the times Michael had stopped by with papers, always in a rush, always with a reassuring tone that made everything seem routine. Just standard updates, Mom, he would say, placing a pen gently in my hand, smiling in that familiar way that used to put me at ease. I never questioned it. I trusted him. That realization settled deeper than anything else. It was not just what they had done. It was how easily I had allowed it to happen. I stood up slowly and walked to the dresser, opening the top drawer where I kept old folders, neatly organized, each one labeled in my own handwriting. I pulled them out one by one, laying them across the bed, creating a quiet map of decisions I thought I had made myself. The room felt different now, like it was no longer just a place of rest, but a place of reckoning. I opened each folder carefully, scanning signatures, dates, small details I had once overlooked. At the time, they had seemed insignificant, just another part of keeping things in order. Now, they felt like pieces of something much larger, something deliberate. I paused when I found a document I barely remembered signing, the language vague enough to pass unnoticed, yet specific enough to grant access, to allow changes that should never have been made without my full understanding. I sat back on the bed, the papers spread out in front of me, and let the silence settle again, heavier now, but no longer confusing. It was clear. They had not just excluded me from dinner. They had been rewriting my place in this family for a long time. Slowly, quietly, I looked around the room, at the framed photo of Michael as a young boy standing proudly beside me on his first day of school, his hand gripping mine tightly, as if he would never let go. I remembered the years that followed, the sacrifices that never felt like sacrifices because they were simply part of loving him, part of building a life together. I remembered the nights I stayed up late helping him study, the mornings I woke up early to make sure everything was ready for him, the countless moments that had shaped the person he became. And now, sitting there surrounded by documents I no longer recognized, I understood something that cut deeper than any harsh word could. The distance between us had not been an accident. It had been constructed. Carefully, intentionally. I gathered the papers into a single stack, aligning the edges with precise movements, not out of habit, but out of necessity. Order mattered now. Clarity mattered. I placed the letter on top and held it there for a moment, my fingers resting lightly against the page, grounding myself in something real. I was no longer confused. I was no longer uncertain. For the first time since that dinner, I knew exactly what I was looking at. And more importantly, I knew that whatever came next, I would not be caught off guard again. The next morning arrived quietly, as if nothing had changed, but everything had. I woke before sunrise, not out of habit this time, but because there was no longer any comfort left in staying still. The house felt different, not empty, but observant, as if it had been waiting for me to finally see what had been unfolding within its walls. I carried the stack of documents to the kitchen table and spread them out again, this time with purpose, not confusion. The early light filtered through the window, casting long shadows across the pages, highlighting signatures that now felt foreign, dates that marked moments I could no longer recall clearly. I made myself a cup of coffee, the familiar routine grounding me just enough to keep my thoughts steady, and then I began to read again, slower this time, more carefully, as if each word might reveal something I had missed before. It did not take long. Patterns began to emerge, small at first, then undeniable. Authorizations that transferred access, clauses that allowed modifications, language that was written to sound harmless, almost helpful, but carried consequences I had never intended. I paused when I reached one particular document, the paper slightly thicker than the others, the ink darker, more deliberate. My name was there, signed in my own hand, but the terms beneath it told a different story, one I had never been fully aware of. I leaned back in my chair, letting the realization settle, not as a shock, but as confirmation of something I already knew deep down. This had been planned, not rushed, not careless, but structured in a way that relied on my trust, on my willingness to believe that my own family would never take advantage of me. I looked toward the window, watching as the neighborhood slowly came to life. Cars passing by, people starting their day, unaware that in this quiet kitchen, everything had shifted. My phone sat on the counter, silent, unchanged, just like it had been the night before. No messages, no calls, no explanation. That silence said more than anything else could have. I stood up and walked to the small cabinet near the hallway, opening it to retrieve an old folder I had not touched in years. Inside were documents from a time when things were simpler, when every decision had been made with clarity and mutual understanding. I flipped through them carefully, comparing signatures, dates, wording, noticing the subtle differences between what had once been transparent and what had slowly become obscured. The contrast was unmistakable. I returned to the table and placed the older documents beside the newer ones, aligning them side by side, letting the truth form not through emotion, but through evidence. It was all there. The progression, the shift, the quiet transfer of control. I did not feel anger the way I thought I would. I felt something colder, more precise. Awareness. For years, I had been reacting to what I thought were isolated moments, small changes that could be explained away. But this was not a series of moments. This was a process. And now that I could see it clearly, I understood something else just as important. If it had been built step by step, then it could be undone the same way. I gathered the documents into a neat stack once more, pressing my hand lightly against the top page, steadying myself not against the shock, but against the clarity that came with it. This was no longer about what they had done. It was about what I was going to do next. I did not rush. That was the first decision I made, and it felt more important than anything else. For too long, everything had been happening around me at a pace that was not mine. Conversations rushed, papers signed quickly, decisions presented as if they were already settled. This time, I would move differently. I gathered the documents and placed them into a single folder, one that I chose myself, not one handed to me with a reassuring smile. Then I picked up my phone, holding it for a moment before unlocking it, scrolling through my contacts until I found a name I had not called in years. Mr. Harold Bennett. He had handled our paperwork decades ago, back when every signature came with a full explanation, when nothing was left unclear. I hesitated for only a second before pressing call. The line rang twice before a calm, familiar voice answered, older now, but steady in a way that felt grounding. I introduced myself, and there was a brief pause before recognition settled in. He remembered me, not as a file or a case, but as a person. That alone told me I had made the right choice. I did not explain everything at once. I did not need to. I simply asked for a meeting, and he agreed without hesitation, his tone shifting slightly, becoming more attentive, as if he could hear something in my voice that I had not said out loud. We set a time for the next morning. After I ended the call, I placed the phone back on the table and stood there quietly, letting the decision settle into place. This was the first step, and it was mine. The rest of the day passed in a calm that might have looked ordinary from the outside. I moved through the house, straightening things that did not need straightening, organizing drawers that were already neat, not because they required it, but because it gave my hands something to do while my mind worked through what I had learned. Every now and then, I would glance at the folder on the table, a silent reminder that things had changed, that I was no longer moving through this blindly. By the afternoon, my phone buzzed. A message from Michael. It was brief, casual, as if the previous night had been nothing more than a routine dinner. He asked if I had gotten home safely. No mention of what had been said. No acknowledgement of anything that mattered. I read the message once, then set the phone down without replying. Not out of anger, but out of clarity. Words, I realized, had been part of the problem. Too many explanations, too many reassurances, too many things left unsaid or half said. This time, I would let actions speak. As evening settled in, I returned to the kitchen and sat at the table once more, the folder in front of me, my hands resting lightly on its surface. I thought about the years behind me, the choices I had made, the trust one had given freely without question. I did not regret those things. They had been real. But now, so was this. I looked around the house, at the walls that had held every version of my life, and understood that I was not losing anything. I was finally seeing it clearly. And in that clarity, there was something steady, something unshakable. Tomorrow would not be about confrontation or accusation. It would be about understanding exactly what had been done and what could be undone. I closed the folder gently, not as an ending, but as the beginning of something I should have done a long time ago. The next morning, I arrived 10 minutes early, not because I was anxious, but because I wanted the time to settle into the decision I had already made. Mr. Bennett's office looked exactly as I remembered, modest, orderly, with shelves lined with thick binders and framed certificates that spoke quietly of years spent doing things the right way. When he stepped out to greet me, his expression softened in recognition, and for a moment, I felt something I had not felt in a long time, a sense of being seen without explanation. We sat across from each other at a large wooden desk, and I placed the folder in front of him, sliding it forward without ceremony. He opened it carefully, his movements precise, and began to read. I did not interrupt. I did not explain. I simply watched as his expression shifted, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, then more clearly as he turned each page. There was no shock in his face, only a growing seriousness, the kind that comes from understanding exactly what something means. When he finished, he closed the folder and rested his hands on top of it, looking at me directly. "Did you knowingly approve all of this?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. I met his gaze without hesitation. "No," I said. The word felt steady, grounded in something I had finally accepted as truth. He nodded once, as if that answer confirmed what he had already suspected. Then he began to speak, not quickly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that cut through everything else. He explained the documents, the permissions that had been granted, the way certain language could be used to transfer control without making it obvious. He pointed out specific clauses, dates, sequences of actions that formed a pattern I could now see clearly, laid out in front of me not as scattered pieces, but as a complete structure. It was not accidental. It was not a misunderstanding. It was intentional. I listened without reacting, absorbing each detail, each explanation, letting it settle into place without resistance. When he finished, there was a brief silence, not uncomfortable, but decisive. "There are ways to address this," he said finally, his tone measured, "but it will require careful steps." I nodded, not because I needed reassurance, but because I already understood what he meant. This was not something to confront with emotion. This was something to dismantle with precision. He outlined the process, the actions that could be taken, the documents that could be challenged, the authority that could be restored. Each step was clear, deliberate, grounded in something solid. As he spoke, I felt something shift again, not in a dramatic way, but in a way that settled deeply. Control was not lost. It had been redirected, and now it could be reclaimed. When the meeting ended, I stood up and gathered the folder, holding it a little differently this time, not as something confusing, but as something understood. Mr. Bennett walked me to the door, his expression steady, respectful. "You have more control here than you think," he said quietly. I met his eyes and nodded once. "I know," I replied. Outside, the air felt cooler, sharper, as if the world itself had become more defined. I walked to my car without rushing, each step measured, certain. For the first time since that dinner, I was not reacting to what had been done to me. I was preparing for what I would do next. I did not contact Michael that day, and I did not respond to his message either, because I understood now that silence, when used correctly, was not weakness but space. Space to move without interference, space to see what others would do when they believed they were still in control. Instead, I followed the steps Mr. Bennett had outlined, one by one, without rushing and without hesitation. The first call I made was to the bank, my voice calm, my words precise, requesting a full review of all recent account activities and authorizations. The woman on the other end asked routine questions, her tone polite and professional, unaware that for me, this was not routine at all. As she confirmed details, dates, and transactions, I listened carefully, noting each piece of information, letting it settle into the larger picture I was beginning to understand. There were transfers I had not recognized, approvals that had been processed under permissions I now knew had been quietly granted. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would raise immediate alarm, just enough to shift control over time. When I ended the call, I wrote everything down in a small notebook, my handwriting steady, each line clear, because clarity mattered now more than anything else. The next step was slower, more deliberate. I reviewed the property records again, this time with guidance, comparing what had been filed with what I had originally intended. The differences were subtle, almost invisible unless you knew where to look, but once seen, they could not be ignored. Access had been extended. Authority had been shared in ways that should have required explicit consent, not quiet assumption. I did not feel anger as I uncovered each detail. I felt focus. That was what surprised me the most. The absence of chaos, the presence of something far more controlled. By the afternoon, everything had begun to align, not just in my mind, but in a structured way that could not be dismissed or explained away. I gathered the notes, the documents, and placed them back into the folder, organizing them in a new order, one that reflected understanding instead of confusion. As I did, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Michael, this time slightly more direct, asking if everything was all right, mentioning that I seemed quiet the night before. I read it once, then set the phone aside again, letting it remain unanswered. There would be a time for conversation, but it would not be on his terms. It would not be shaped by his assumptions. It would come when everything was already in place. As the evening approached, I sat once more at the kitchen table, the folder in front of me, my notes beside it, and allowed myself a moment to reflect, not on what had been done, but on what had been revealed. For years, I had believed that trust meant not questioning, that love meant allowing others to take the lead when they seemed more certain. Now I understood that trust without awareness is simply permission given too easily. I closed the folder slowly, pressing my hand against it for a brief moment, grounding myself in the quiet certainty that had replaced the confusion of the night before. This was no longer about reacting. This was about timing. And when the time came, it would not be loud, it would not be emotional, but it would be undeniable. 3 days later, I invited them to dinner, the same way I had done countless times before, my voice calm on the phone, my tone unchanged, giving them no reason to suspect that anything was different, and they accepted without hesitation, perhaps relieved that things seemed to have returned to normal, perhaps confident that whatever had happened before had already settled in their favor. I set the table carefully that afternoon, placing each plate with the same attention I always had, aligning the silverware, smoothing the tablecloth, creating a setting that looked familiar, comfortable, unchanged, even though nothing about it felt the same to me anymore. When they arrived, Lauren stepped in first, her smile bright, her eyes scanning the room quickly as if measuring something invisible, while Michael followed behind her, carrying a bottle of wine he handed to me with a casual ease that felt rehearsed. We exchanged the usual greetings, polite, controlled, each word sitting neatly on the surface without reaching anything deeper. Dinner moved forward in the same quiet rhythm I had come to recognize, conversation light, carefully chosen, nothing too personal, nothing too real. I let them speak, let them fill the space, listening more than responding, observing the way they moved, the way they glanced at each other, the way they assumed that everything was still within their control. When the plates were cleared and the moment felt right, I stood up without announcing anything and walked to the side table where I had placed a single folder. I returned and set it gently in front of them, not sliding it across, not forcing it into their hands, just placing it there where it could not be ignored. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Michael reached forward, slower than usual, opening it with a hesitation I had never seen in him before. Lauren leaned closer, her expression tightening slightly as the first page came into view. I said nothing. I did not need to. The documents spoke clearly enough. The room, which had been filled with quiet conversation just moments before, shifted into a different kind of silence, one that carried weight, one that could not be dismissed. Michael turned another page, then another, his movements becoming more deliberate, his face losing the ease it had held all evening. Lauren's posture changed beside him, her shoulders stiffening, her gaze moving quickly across the lines as if searching for something that was no longer there. I watched them, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a calm I had never felt before, a calm that came from understanding exactly what was happening. When Michael finally looked up at me, there was something different in his eyes, not confusion, not even guilt, but the realization that whatever control he thought he had was no longer his to hold. I met his gaze steadily and spoke, my voice even, measured, carrying no trace of the uncertainty that had once defined me. I told him that I had reviewed everything, that I understood every document, every authorization, every step that had been taken without my full awareness, and that it had all been addressed. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply stated what was true. Lauren opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came out, her confidence slipping in a way that was almost imperceptible but undeniable. I closed the folder gently and rested my hand on top of it for a moment before standing up. "You did not embarrass me," I said quietly, my eyes moving from one to the other. You revealed yourselves. I turned and walked toward the door, not waiting for a response, not needing one, because everything that needed to be understood had already been made clear, and as I stepped outside into the cool evening air, I realized that for the first time in a long time, I was not leaving something behind, I was taking something back.